prioritising positivity, I cover Australian politics. I'm clearly doing the wrong thing. Ladies and gentlemen, you're not here to talk about Australian politics, so we might be able to stay positive, but given the topic that we are here to discuss, we will see how we go. My name's Peter Van Onselen. I'm not going to introduce the panel to you. You've all got your programs. You all know their credentials. I'm going to do something that I find very hard today, actually, and try to be as quiet as possible, because this isn't my area of expertise, but having read through the CVs and knowing the three people sitting to my right, this is going to be such a fun session to be able to talk about when China rules the world, not even putting a question mark on it in the program. We've got three really eminent experts in the field, all of whom can at least speak some Chinese, but we won't do that. So let's get into it if I can. Linda, let me start with you. You wanted to go first. You wanted to talk about when China rules the world. You take it as a fait accompli?
No, but I think that we need to think about it. And I think the best way of looking to the future is to look to the past. So who else has ruled the world? The United States, the British Empire, Belgium in the Congo, Soviet Union over a number of states that are now independent. What happens? These places go in and they want to exploit the resources and the labor of those countries. They each did it in different ways. In America, it's guided by corporate capitalism. In the British Empire, you did have those big companies and so on. Different modes of doing that, but the basic goal is to exploit resources and labor for your own purposes. So, what do you do when there's problems, when there's resistance? You could buy the leadership, you can buy the government, you can bribe the government, you can spread information. The British mission in the British Empire was civilizing. It was a civilizing mission. So you give people British values, you give people British education, and you convert them to a British way of life and a British value system. That means they're less likely, supposedly, to go away from it. So what does that mean for looking at China? I mean, we have to look at a lot of those things are already in place. So we look at the way China is going into Africa. I mean, look, here, they buy minerals, and they get what they need with education and so on. They also export their own values. If you look at China itself, we always talk about Chinese students in Australia, but if you look at the Chinese universities in China, there's a lot of African students and so on, so they're exporting their values as well. And we all know about influence scandals and so on. So you have this thing, and I think it'll only intensify as China gets stronger vis-a-vis other countries.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a Q&A session in the back 15 or so minutes of this overall session. There's also an opportunity online. I have my phone with me. You can send out tweets with the hashtag Integrity20. That's Integrity20. If you've got questions or comments during the course of the discussion, or I guess if you don't like the questions that I'm asking, you can send yours through, and I'll keep an eye on that as well. Richard, can I come to you? You've covered China in a lot of detail in the region for a long time, not wanting to age you, but...
It's wisdom, I think, is what you're looking at.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
How concerned, if at all, are you about this notion of China controlling the world as a non-democracy?
Well, I think I'd be very worried. To just look at the ledger in Australia, for example. Australia's done well out of the post-war order, Pax Americana. Look what's happening now in our bilateral relationship, for example. Talk about prioritising positivity. I wrote a list of issues that we've got problems with China on, big and small. Swimmers, drugs, Crown Casino, the Pacific Step-Up, Solomon, Papua New Guinea, Huawei, Gladys Liu, South China Sea, general issues of interference, our relations with the US, trade, coal, Bali and that, Marines in Darwin, Hong Kong, the protests on the University of Queensland campus, for example, two groups clashing, the Chinese-Australian writer, Mr. Yang, in prison, and of course the Uyghurs. So it's pretty difficult, actually.
Well, I guess the next question then is a follow-up. I mean, you'll have more to say on that, but as a follow-up to you, a big part of how much of an issue these issues are is how we react to them. Would that be fair, Richard?
Well, I think that's true, and I think and to answer that and to go back to your first question, in a big picture sense, the issue with China is what is it that China is doing that any big country would do? So of course, they're a big country. They're entitled to have, invest in their military like the US. They want to be the dominant country in their region. Nothing surprising about that. So there's nothing surprising about any of that. But what are they also doing that's different? Because they're not a democracy, they're a party state. So how do you balance those two things, and how do you deal with China as a party state, particularly at a time when they are getting stronger? We hear a lot about the slowing Chinese economy. I don't think it's slowing that much, actually. And I think there's no reason for China to step back and negotiate with anybody or give up anything with the US at the moment, because in 5-10 years, they might be stronger. Now, just to finish that point, I'm not so sure they will rule the world. I'll give you one example about that in Asia in particular. If you think about the US, big bad America, has done a lot of bad things, the Iraq War, for example. You think about Asia. China has territorial disputes in one way or another with South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and little old Brunei. So the idea that China can come in and just take America's place in Asia, I think, is a fantasy. And of course, there's Taiwan on top of that, which is the big issue. So I think we're going in an extremely difficult couple of decades.
Dr. Wang, a colleague of mine at Griffith University, in a past life, I don't know if you all read this in the program, or if I'm actually revealing something I'm not supposed to, but he was an interpreter in pretty significant meetings with Chinese leaders. He's promised us some massive exclusives on that a little bit later in the chat, so don't go anywhere. But what are your impressions about how China's outward focus has changed, if it has changed, in recent decades, as there seems to be more, maybe not inevitability after what Richard just said, but perhaps more certainty amongst some about its growing dominance?
Well, China has had its ups and downs, but mostly a success story in the past 40 years or so. It's a country that's been through, as you all know, through a century of humiliation, mostly in the hands of the Western powers. Now, here's an opportunity to get stronger. So it's been trying to rise up, hopefully in the right way. In fact, at least China says it will do the right thing. That's why, hence the tag, peaceful rise. That was more prominent a phrase during the Hu Jintao era, the immediate past president of China. He was the harmonious leader, and he internally advocated a harmonious society as well. Even though China was already taking off economically during his era, and of course a little earlier than that, the Jiang Zemin era, if those names still make some sense to most of you. If you recall the Bob Hawke era here in Australia, the relationship was very warm at all levels until the Tiananmen crackdown, 1989. But even after that, when Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader, the late leader, restarted market reforms after 1992, there was renewed warmth still here in Australia under Keating, and so on. And even during the John Howard era, only during the first year it was a bad start. Howard was learning to place Australia in the Asian region, the debate about its history and geography and so on. But then he managed to mend the fences with China, and the two countries economically became so interdependent. A lot of the LNG projects, the big billion-dollar projects, started taking off during John Howard's reign. And now, on the Chinese side, I was talking about the previous two leaders, then the Xi Jinping era did make a bit of a difference. People might recall the South China Sea issues, and then internally, the ending of the limit of the tenure of the presidency. Those two issues were quite Oh, sorry, I was going on for too long.
No.
Yes.
I'm an
I was trying
academic.
to, jog
I'm an
people's
academic too.
memory
I
too.
get it. I
Sure.
get it. Linda, let me fast forward though to the Chinese leadership of the here and now, and some of the rule changes that make it more dictatorial internally, apart from anything else, rather than party orientated. How do you see that affecting the rise of China?
Well, it's very interesting. Dr. Wang was talking about the warmth of the relationship in the 80s, and I was in China for a lot of the 80s, and it was a very different era. So there was a lot more freedom of expression permitted. There was a lot of excitement, cultural innovation, and experimentation. That contributed. I think we don't do well if we overlook the cultural aspects of relationships. We were very excited about what was going on in China at the time because there seemed to be so much going on, and people were debating their own problems and issues very, very vocally, with great excitement. What's happened now is with Xi Jinping, and Richard knows a lot more about Xi Jinping. He's written a book about him, but Xi Jinping has been closing down debate, trying to make all China speak with one voice, emphasizing the 150 years of humiliation from the time of the Opium Wars and China's humiliation at the hands of various imperial powers as a unifying narrative so that the Chinese people now have the right to stand up and not be humiliated. So you stand with Hong Kong, you're humiliating me. There's a really strong patriotic narrative that started in 1992 with or 91 with the patriotic education campaign. But Xi Jinping has shut down voices that in the 1980s would have flourished. Even things like feminists in the metro stations holding signs or wearing T-shirts that say, what I wear doesn't mean you can sexually harass me. Those people were arrested. That sort of thing is unacceptable. A whole lot of conversation in China is unacceptable. That means that, from my perspective, you get a very strong and perhaps bewildering, bamboozling notion of a unified China. If you actually go to China and you know a lot of people, you know that it's a very heterogeneous place with a multitude of ideas. So many dissidents have been silenced, they've been imprisoned, they've been, some of them been tortured and killed, that what's happened is we are bamboozled by this notion of this unified China. But I was reading this somewhere. Somebody said, places are authoritarian until they're not. So as long as that can be maintained, we're going to see something.
Well, that was my next question, which you might want to bounce off. But Richard, to you, I mean, you have written about this. Your first book specifically on China in 2010 looked at the internals of the Communist Party there as well. Did you see this coming with this change by Xi Jinping, or did it surprise you at all?
Well, actually, the book on the Communist Party was published in 2010. If you look back on it now and see things that aren't correct in it, one of them was that China had moved to a form of collective leadership. So Hu Jintao, head of the Politburo, was first amongst equals. I didn't say that would last forever, but I certainly didn't predict a swing back to a sort of single strongman leader, because China is a big, complicated country. And the whole point of the changes ushered in by Deng Xiaoping in the early 80s was to stop another dictator coming back. So let me illustrate it like this in the way that you put it in your question. One of the big things that Xi Jinping has done is to end this idea of an orderly succession or term limits. And that was done by making the president have 2 5-year terms. And that way the party secretary of the Communist Party had 2 5-year terms. It's one of, as Wang Yi said, China is a success story. One of the authoritarian countries generally have a big issue with having orderly successions, non-violent successions. China has managed that from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping.
So what happens now? Because it's such a change.
Well, we don't know what happens now. In fact, there's one of the great paper that a friend of mine wrote, is what happens if Xi Jinping dies? And nobody knows, because there's no process by which to replace him. And that's the thing that Communist Party fears the most, is having a public split at the top. Because that happened in 1989. And if you have a split at the top, then all sorts of actors throughout the system feel they have the agency to run their own race. And then things can fall apart quickly. So I don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long Xi Jinping will be there for, but sooner or later, I think China will have a succession crisis.
Do you agree with that, a succession crisis?
Well, actually, the people in China have tasted the benefit of institutionalized succession of the leadership. I wouldn't be surprised. We've got a party conference coming up, actually, later this week. There may be some news out of that, even. But in the coming years, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a revised party platform in terms of party leadership succession, because there was almost a consensus before the change that that's the way to go. And Deng Xiaoping made it happen. He handed over to Jiang to Hu, each with a reasonable limit of term. And now, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new revived consensus.
But don't you think that if they actually put that back in, then suddenly that's going to cause everybody to say people are not united behind Xi? I mean, that's the danger in a system like that. The second you say, oh, actually, let's put in the party limits, suddenly everybody sees that there's a struggle behind the scenes. So it's quite dangerous.
Richard, what happens then if that does go public, as Linda says?
Well, if you talk to the Xi Jinping camp, they say the reason he hasn't appointed a successor is because remember that Xi Jinping has created a lot of problems. A lot of foreign governments are pushing back against China, but don't forget there's a lot of internal pushback against Xi Jinping as well. He has a lot of enemies at home because he's been such a tough leader. The anti-corruption campaign, literally, jailing, destroying the careers of hundreds of members of the wealthy elite. So there's a big backlash there. Also, the technocratic elite are also very critical of him for his management of the economy, his sort of his emphasis on the state sector and the like. There's a big backlash internally. I think at the moment, because of the fight with Trump, there's a bit of a rally around the flag moment for him. But his camp always said, well, look, he's made so many enemies at home. People can't attack him. If he appoints a successor, there'll be a target on that person's back. So we'll just leave it to the side. But eventually it's got to come back.
I just want to shift tack just for a moment and talk a little bit about how the rest of the world treats China and views China. So many differences. We should probably start right here. Dr. Wang, can I start with you? Australia, how it treats China.
Indeed, I think that where most interests converge with this audience would be how we react to China from the West, from outside China. It's a matter of perception partly, and it's also a matter of interaction. China, in the past 40 years or so, has been opening up to the world, adopting a lot of internationalized practices. We're on the road to strengthening that trend when, for well-known reasons, there's a change of climate. The Trump factor weighs heavily on my mind when I think about this issue. Of course, when the Trump era started with his unpredictability and so on and so forth, and US-China trade row, people said, wow, Trump is not the cause. He's the phenomenon. He's the symptom of the issues bubbling up. Well, that may be a clever way of saying it. It may be a true paradox more internally for the US politics than internationally. Internationally, the paradox, I don't see it as a true one. It's only a rhetorical one, as a headline-grabbing device.
Can we speculate then? Can I get you to fast forward and assume Trump wins the next presidential election and how you think that might impact on US-China relations? And then I'll get Richard and Linda's views as well. He has nothing to worry about after that, whether he worries now.
Well, the current trade negotiations are still going on. We're heading towards some kind of settlement, at least temporarily. But my main point is that the Trump factor internationally is a cause as well as a symptom. Why do I say that? Because how China is being encouraged to open up further, to liberalize further, depends to a large extent, as has been proven in the past 40 years, on the outside world's interactions with it. The Trump tactics have lifted a very thin veil. In Chinese, it's like 撕破脸皮. 撕 means tear, 破, broken. To tear broken the face, not even the mask. The face skin is torn off because in the past we talked about China said the West was trying to contain China. The West tried to deny that. John Hout here said our alliances are not aimed at a third country, not at China. And George W. Bush and then Obama and so on, they were just shadowboxing around the issue without really owning up to it. But now Trump turned all of that.
Okay, so let me jump in. So Richard, if a re-elected Trump, another 4 years of Trump, US-China relations, how do you see it?
Well, I think a re-elected Trump would be a windfall for China. But let me explain, go back a little bit. I think Trump's first year or two, he did really well with China, actually. I don't know without realizing it, but he's so unpredictable. He's a minute-to-minute proposition. The Chinese thought they could flatter him and make a deal. And of course, he completely destabilized the Chinese leadership, because he said he would introduce tariffs, and my God, he did. There was a sort of school of thought about a year ago, or mid-last year in China, that Trump was a real kind of strategic genius, because they did not know how to handle him.
Watching too much Sky News after dark.
Yeah. But I think that moment is gone now. I think the Chinese have realised that it's pointless making deals with Trump. They might make a small one soon, but it's a small one. Because remember, with the US and China, we've got full spectrum competition coming for a long time, technology, ideology, everything. So Trump, in my view, he's kind of destroying the US system. He's destroying US foreign relationships with Europe. He constantly humiliates Japan, even though Japan's worked hard to work with him. South Korea. Look at the way Australia has to sort of hug him tight so he doesn't do anything nasty to us. So I think no matter what the government says privately, and you're in Canberra, you'd know better than me, but the Foreign Ministry and the Department of Defence think if Trump's re-elected, well, we have to rethink our policy. So
just today, Joe Hockey gave a scathing speech on his way out the door as US ambassador about some of the policy positions that Donald Trump's taken. But let's not digress onto that. Linda, I mean, you might want to make a comment as well, but I want to also ask about this adage that seems to be an old one now, that China should only be allowed in, because it's already well and truly in the international system, to say the least, if it democratises. That's come and gone. There was sort of quarters of thought in that direction, but then it was too big and too much of an opening up market for the line to even come close to being held on that. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that there was a lot of delusional thinking when Deng Xiaoping came into power and made the first market reforms in the economy and opened the door. It was open door and reform, opened the door of China to the outside world, and everybody's like, okay, they're going to be capitalist. They're drinking Coca-Cola now. They're going to be democratic. It was completely delusional, and a number of us, even at the time, were saying, no, you're not actually listening. You're not looking. You're not thinking. This is not necessarily a move in any kind of straight line towards either capitalism or democracy. And I think Xi Jinping has well and truly put those illusions to rest. But I think that there was another fantasy that began in the 90s when people began getting rich in China, and the birth of the middle class was seen. Today there's hundreds of millions of middle-class Chinese. That's enormous. Hundreds and hundreds of millions. And people are saying, oh, when people are wealthy and their kids go out to study and they go traveling and they get access to more things, they're going to become more interested in democratic ideals. Again, didn't happen. For the most part, that didn't happen. People are like, wow, look at this system that has allowed me a comfortable and wonderful lifestyle that my parents and grandparents couldn't have dreamed of. So why would I rock the boat? And a lot of students come here not to study political science or cultural studies or anything that would expose them. A lot of students are here studying business and technology, engineering and so on. So It's a very interesting question. But can I just add one little thing about the other?
You're going to anyway.
You're right. Where Australia stands, I co-edit the China Story yearbook for the ANU, and I was recently looking at an article by a Korean scholar, and he was talking about South Korea's dilemma, and he said they rely on the US for their security, and they rely on China for their economy. The trade is like that, and I thought, gee, that's a little bit like Australia in many ways. And he brought up a Korean saying, which is, when a shrimp gets caught between two whales, the shrimp's back gets broken.
Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to open up to Q&A in less than 15 minutes from now. And just a reminder, there are some tweets coming in, but not many, on the hashtag Integrity20. That's Integrity20. I'd encourage you to use that if you feel so inclined. Richard, one of the themes of Integrity20 is about moral responsibilities for the future. What's the moral responsibility for the future when it comes to China, both for the rest of the world and within China?
Gosh, I really, I don't want to sound like a hardened old hack or something, but I resist using the word moral when it comes to politics, particularly when it comes to foreign policy.
It's the theme.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, I won't be invited back next year. But I think I would like to prefer to use the word principled. And, maybe underlying principles is a certain morality or a certain bedrock of morality. I think in the case of Australia, the debate we've had about China has been extremely messy. I've only moved back to Australia last year. Wasn't here for all of it. Very messy. Obviously borderline, there's a bit of, we all know the history of Australia, the history of racism and everything against Chinese, against Asians. So it's a tough debate to have when you're talking about the values that Chinese, not the CCP, the Communist Party, are bringing in. All of that is difficult, but I think it's necessary because the first things first in Australia, you have to make sure your own democratic system is resilient.
Exactly.
The institutions are working and the like. The system is not corrupted. Now, there's the case of Mr. Wang, the donor. Maybe he's guilty of corruption, but we invited him in to be corrupted. So I think that's the foundation of a relationship with China. And I think also we're going to have a much more difficult foreign policy. We're either entering the golden era of Australian foreign policy or we're going to sort of fall flat on our faces. And I don't know what it is yet. But I think if we base it on our own principles and energetic engagement, not just with China, but with the Pacific, which we're doing, and I think Southeast Asia is the key because we have a lot of common interests with them when it comes to China.
Dr. Wang, it's such a fascinating concept because in years gone by, it seemed like this push for democratization in China, even if it was a Western ideal and had various elements that go with that, there was some oomph behind it. But now, exactly as Richard alludes to, our system, our democratic system here, as well as in so many other similarly culturally historic countries, seems so broken. How can you take the moral high ground at all, arguing for it when looking at China? You agree? Well, okay. Let me turn that into a different question. How do you think the Chinese see it when they look back on it?
Well, some are trumpeting the China model. Some debate it. Some say it's too early to tell. But at least we do see the issues associated with Western-style democracy, Trump being one of the phenomena. Now, to finish off on this Trumpian point, Trump, by lifting the veil, he made it so stark. Even the moderates in China, whom I used to work with, I know they were harboring some goodwill and they wanted to open up the country further, now would get shut in, saying, look, it's hostile forces surrounding us. Trump made it explicit, not just explicit, very stark reality. He wants not only to contain China, but to roll China's progress back. So all the so-called hardliners will have a field day saying, look, we were proven right, we were vindicated. So that makes the matters worse.
Okay, just a couple of quick ones where I want very short, and then we'll get back to a longer discussion. Linda, starting with you. They're not easy, but Hong Kong, what happens
In the future, or what's...
in the short term?
Phew, that is the big question. That will tell us so much more about when China rules the world, because there's what they've done so far is they've let Carrie Lam, the head of government, do all the dirty work. They've let the police do the dirty work, and there's some indication, there's some rumors, but we don't know, that some police have been taken in from the mainland.
So what happens? How does it get resolved?
How does it get resolved? This is the thing that's the million-dollar question. I would say the day they bring in the tanks is the day they lose completely.
Okay, but that's an interesting answer in and of itself. A big I don't know is one hell of an answer. Richard?
Well, I think they won't bring in the tanks, or
they lose.
but I think what's going to happen is they're going to grind through the gears. You'll see many more people locked up, attempt to isolate the radicals. The Hong Kong economy, I think, is about to go into a recession. I think they're hoping that will reduce support. There's popular support for the protesters there.
People just focus on their own self.
Well, eventually, when your brother or sister gets sacked from their job because the slowing economy, support for the protesters will collapse. They'll lock a lot of them up, and people will be frightened into behaving. I think the best description I heard of it from a Chinese perspective, the ruthless perspective, was let the protesters eat themselves. And maybe we're sort of in the early stages of that.
There has been a lot of difference.
It's not going to be nice.
Because there have been a lot of disagreements
Yes.
about how to protest.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's
Definitely.
a core radical. There is violence by the protesters. They can rationalise that, but nonetheless, it's not a winning strategy long
Okay,
term.
we're running out of time. Dr. Wang, on Hong Kong, what happens?
Don't have the crystal ball.
But a big don't know, is that because it could literally go either way?
Now, I don't think the government will do anything foolish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. I know you're chapping at the bit to breach all those confidences. But first up, America and China from an Australian perspective. I know nothing's ever really that binary, but do we ever have to choose, or at least get close to having to choose?
Well, at least Australia should not be forced to choose. John Mearsheimer recently had a debate with Hugh White. He made it quite explicit. Well, we're forcing you to choose as an ally, as the bigger brother of the alliance. I don't think it's wise for the US to do that. Provided, well, actually, I wanted to sound a caveat to the very premise of our debate today. When China rules the world, will it? Actually, it's a big caveat because internally, China is faced with aging. The single-child generation is coming up and running the country. Then, even if there were war possibilities, will this generation pick up the fighting spirit anymore? China will be a vastly different society by and by.
Can I jump in on that? Richard, how relevant is generational change in China?
Oh, it's a very big deal. China's about to go off the demographic cliff. They're going to lose 160 million people of working age in the next 20 years. So they're not going to, the economy won't grow. They've got a big pension issue, aging society, looking after parents. And that's something you cannot control.
And just quickly, because it is a small question, does Australia ever have to choose between the US and China?
Well, I'll say two things on that very quickly. We've chosen, right? We've chosen America already. We've doubled down on the security alliance, as you would expect. But we won't be able to avoid further choices. There's the old phrase they used to use about the Middle East, I'll refashion it. You may not be interested in the US and China conflict, but the US and China conflict is very interested in you. And so we're going to have to make all manner of choices based around that issue.
Linda, on that choice, any predictions?
We're the shrimp. We'll get our backs broken.
Or the ham in the sandwich would be the other one. Okay, with the time we've got left before we open up to questions, I'd actually like to let each of you say something on China that you think's important, because inevitably, as the non-expert, I would have missed something pretty obviously that you think has to be focused on. Linda?
I think that to reprise a point I made earlier. China is an enormously heterogeneous place. For all the voices that you hear, there are many voices that have been suppressed or that you don't access because you don't speak Chinese. So it's really important to remember that if things go a little bit wonky with Xi, if things can change, a new China can emerge. It's not it tries to present itself officially as one voice, but it is never one voice. And I listen to a podcast called 故事 FM. Do you ever listen to that? It's the Story FM. And every day, 3 times a week, the most extraordinary stories of Chinese people told in their own voices, and it just serves to remind you of what an extraordinary country it is, of the talent, of the weirdness, of the sorrows and the joys of ordinary life that we often lose sight of when we have such a focused political perspective.
Dr. Wang, what's an important part of the rise of China and the ongoing rise of China that we haven't gotten to?
Well, communication is very important. Communicate correctly, appropriately, so that both sides, both the outside world and China itself.
This sounds like it's going to one of these great stories about what you've seen in the past, internally.
You mean?
Well,
As an interpreter.
As an interpreter, leaders. Yeah.
Yes.
Who
You were leading that way.
Who is, okay, I might have to prize this out, ladies and gentlemen. Who's a world leader that you think surprised the Chinese leadership the most in your time when you were interpreting their highly confidential conversations?
Well, let me reveal some big official secrets here. I used to interpret visiting delegations from the US congressmen, Australian delegations as well. I think the Australians tended to know China a bit better than their American counterparts. I have to give you that. The US Congress people, both men and women, they had strong ideas about China. They had preconceptions. The evangelical message of democracy, American style, the manifest destiny sort of thinking, it permeates their thinking. Well, I was trying to think back. Around the time of the June 4th crackdown, 1989, or just slightly after that, there were several rounds of Western delegations visiting China as inspector generals. The Chinese side used to call them that. And they themselves went in as human rights fighters and so on. And here the two sides clashed because they proceeded from very different premises. They were not into the same dialogue, on different wavelengths, really.
I mean, because I've been joking about this, but I actually find it absolutely fascinating that you were in the room for some of these. And I know that you have to be careful in what you say, but how frank are the discussions?
Oh, it can be very frank. Now, let me give you a specific example. Actually, this shows China's knowledge of the West vis-a-vis the West's knowledge of China. I think among the Chinese leadership, there's slightly more knowledge about the West than the other way around. For instance, when President Jiang Zemin was in power, if some of you can recall his image, he used to speak some English. Well, he can carry on a conversation in English. That's how he managed to shake hands with John Howard after a year's tense relationship at the APEC summit. And Howard was so grateful that it happened because Australia trade was dependent on the China market, and he couldn't crack open the Chinese leadership's doors. And at the international multilateral setting, Howard managed to have a good chat with Jiang, who returned in English, saying, "Face to face, much better, isn't it?" in his style of English. And Howard said, "Oh, yeah." And then they started chatting. So since then, his wife Jeanette also went on trips with Howard to China many times, both during his prime ministership and afterwards, and even to the point that President Jiang was quizzing Jeanette, who was a school teacher, on, tell me something about Shakespeare. And Jeanette, each time, would have to brush up on her Shakespeare. And
Brilliant. I thank you for that. I appreciate you giving us those insights. I actually wish you all the best the next time you go through customs. But and
I'll blame Shakespeare.
ladies, I'm talking about Peter Dutton, not China. Okay, we're going to open up to Q&A in a moment. But ladies and gentlemen, Richard, the last word. I'm sure you must have, well, probably a lot of things, but at least one major thing that we haven't got to that you think is important.
Related to Linda's point, I always hate we hear the official statements out of China about we have lifted 800 million people out of poverty, and I say no. 800 million people have lifted themselves out of poverty once you got out of the way. It's a much better way of thinking about it. So I'm always amazed by the sheer energy, ambition, and inventiveness of the Chinese people. Political inventiveness, because they've got to work their way through the system as well. And I'm in awe of the system as well, that the system has stayed together, Communist Party, and managed to harness all that energy and ambition. So my view is don't underestimate China.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are over time, so I hope you've all enjoyed this. I had an absolutely fabulous time. I always say that, but I often don't mean it. But I actually really mean it. I genuinely mean it today. So please join me in thanking our panellists.
Thank you.